for coming back after the lunch. I would like to welcome all the people watching live. The first presenter talking about the scope of the competition is going to be Richard Morris from Innovate UK. You will have the chance to ask him questions in the Q&A session. The same for the people watching online. If you can just type your questions, my colleague Naz will ask them on your behalf. Thank you.
Thanks, George. So just to introduce myself, my name is Richard Morris. I'm the innovation lead for connected and autonomous vehicles at Innovate UK, and Innovate UK is delivering this competition. So I'd like to talk to you this afternoon a little bit about the scope of the competition, and go into perhaps a little bit more detail about what we want and what the restrictions are. And then you can ask questions in the Q&A after my colleague Joe has been through his slides. Okay. So in terms of the content of this presentation, I'm going to go through a little bit of background and the general aspects. I'm going to go through some of the requirements, which are mandatory, some recommendations and suggestions as well. Talk about what's not in the scope, and then go on to talk about what sort of business plans we expect as part of the applications. And a little bit on data management and IT. The funding requirements and funding structures that we're using. Talk a little bit about the funding part for the Meridian, which I know that Richard Porter's touched on earlier this morning, but we'll flesh that out a little bit. And talk about a few other requirements and value for money. What I'd just like to point out is that we have a unique guidance for applicants document for this competition. So please read it. It will not be the same as ones you've read before. It will be different. So please, can you make sure that you do read it? And it does differ from the Meridian 3 guidance for applicants. Okay, so getting to the meat of it. The scope of the competition is to support CCAVs who wish to invest up to £5 million in a single project to develop one or more platforms for the exchange of connected vehicle data. Now, we've heard from Michael Talbot this morning, and the aim is to produce the world's most effective CAV testing ecosystem in the UK. Obviously, it's the world's most effective ecosystem, but we want to do it here in the UK. The proposals should facilitate the exchange of data to test, develop, demonstrate, and exploit connected and autonomous vehicle opportunities. The platform should be adaptable to cope with increasing volumes and new types of data formats, and to make those accessible and appropriate for the users, whoever they may be. There's a link there to the competition scope, which I'm sure you've all read in great detail since it was published this time last week. This is a slide which I think quite a few of you in the industry should be familiar with. It's basically what came out of the call for evidence, which started this in the introduction of these facilities through CCAV. Phase 1, as we've seen, has already produced 4 projects with on 5 main sites. And in this competition, we're looking at part of phase 2, on the right-hand side, the data management and analytics side. What we're not covering in this part of phase 2 is the parts on the left. The 4 streams on the left are covered in Meridian 3, which we discussed last Friday, in this very room, in fact. So just to make it clear, this competition will support just a single data project. So ideally, we want each other and to work together. We did think about, should we have multiple projects which are doing different things, but then we'd have to sort out how to link you all together at the end. That's actually really difficult. So it makes more sense to get you to talk to each other up front so you can work out what you want to do. Okay, some of the basic requirements. So your proposal will support the sharing and trading of road transportation data. And that can be either generated by the infrastructure, by the vehicles themselves, or by anybody else. But crucially, it must speed up the development and realize the benefits of connected autonomous vehicles. That's the takeaway line. So your project must be globally significant. It's got to be reasonable size. It's got to have sufficient mass to be of value and to gain traction in the industry. And it should allow for the usage of scalable systems to collect or access, process, and share data with users with appropriate remuneration. I'd just like to go into one of those words, the word collect. I want to make clear that here, what we mean by collect is pull together existing data or data from existing sources. Proposing that in this project, you go out and fit sensors to vehicles or roads or whatever. That's not what we're funding. If the sensors and that information is available, it's to fund the collection, bring it all together into one point. So the project must also develop sustainable business models and processes to improve the accessibility and the availability of the data. And we expect there'll be a certain amount of processing of the data within this facility, whatever it is, which must protect privacy, ensure the quality, and protect the intellectual property of those who provided the data. Looking at what the projects should also do, you want you to demonstrate routes to commercial viability and sustainable business models. So that's sustainability of the facility that will be created by the project. It gets a bit confusing because we're expecting various projects and users to use that to develop their own business models, but it's the former that we're interested in here. We want you to prove that this facility is sustainable. The projects need to demonstrate this in terms of data ethics, security and privacy, including dealing with the anonymization of data and compliance with GDPR. It had to come in somewhere, didn't it? We expect you to demonstrate the use of cutting-edge technologies. So we've heard mentioned this morning of blockchain. That might be one of them. We expect you to generate and or use real-world data. And in this context, by generating, I mean generating derived data, not generating raw data. Data coming in from different streams, and from that you can manipulate, add value, and generate a new data set. That's what we mean by generate in this particular context. Projects should be demonstrably representative of the target environment in the UK and other appropriate target CAV markets. Obviously, the UK is where we are, so we'd expect that to be the main focus, but we're not restricting its application to UK. The project should also have suitable hardware to develop and demonstrate platform services that will support the CAV deployment. And where applicable, the project should demonstrate that there's been consultation and planning with road owners and operators, if that is appropriate. We also expect that the project should be able to contribute to a CAV data working group, which will be organized by Meridian. And that group will inform and influence policy and standards. And finally, the project should also support and encourage integration and collaboration across the wider UK CAV ecosystem. I think the last one is fairly self-evident. Preference is going to be given to projects that can provide, that can prove that they can deliver operational facilities that complement or build on existing facilities. Now, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to duplicate what's out there. There are some very good projects which are working in this area. It would be beneficial to build on those rather than start again, unless you can demonstrate to us that it's better value not to. So if you can demonstrate, that's a different issue, but fundamentally, we'd rather not reinvent the wheel. Projects will be supported through investment aid for research infrastructures. So we'd like to understand that is an Article 26 under the state aid rules rather than Article 25, which is what most of our projects are. This is Article 26. So this is a type of state aid that allows grant funding to support the construction or upgrade of research facilities. Obviously, the core infrastructure of the facility or the system should be future-proofed as much as possible. It's a fast-moving area. Things are going to change. We know they're going to change, and the facility should have a life of 10 years, at least 10 years. So making it flexible and future-proofed is very important. Proposal should detail how the project will facilitate the improvement and testing of as many data transaction scenarios as possible. And the bid team must propose these scenarios supported by the business model. This morning, Effion Jenkins talked about the local transport data discovery project. I was rather hoping to come here today and wave a copied report and say, unfortunately, it's not been signed off by the minister yet, which is a little bit of a shame. But I'm hoping it will be imminent. And the reason for saying that is because it contains some very important or very relevant recommendations, although not all are directly relevant to this particular competition. So what I suggest is for those who are interested, you contact Graham DFT and request that copies or at least a web link is sent to you when the report is finally released. I hope it's this week, but obviously I can't promise. And for those of you who don't know what's in it, which will probably be most of you, I've pulled out the appropriate page which summarizes the report's recommendations. And the bits which are ticked in green are the ones which I think are pertinent and relevant to this competition. Don't worry about taking photographs of it because it will be available in the presentation afterwards, because I guess you're going to struggle with the detail of the font size. So even if this is not approved by the minister, and let's face it, that's a possibility, I would say that these actually hit pretty much the sorts of issues which you should be looking at to cover in the project. So I think they're still valid, so I'll put them up there anyway. It's not mandatory, but I think you should consider it if you're going to be looking at using local authority data. And let's face it, why would you not want to do that? So what is out of scope for this competition? Funding the construction of a commodity data center. Big shiny buildings with lots of computer servers in is not what we're about. There are a lot of people doing that already. What's more interesting is what goes inside it in terms of the intellectual property and the structure of the facility. So not a big shiny box. We're not looking for projects that significantly replicate existing facilities which are already available in the UK. Build on them, yes. Replicate them, no. Also out of scope, industrial research and development or feasibility study projects. Also, we don't want to look at projects which are focusing on synthetic data. We want it to be real world data. Finally, road transportation is in. So projects which aren't focused on road transportation will be excluded, as will projects which focus entirely on confidential vehicle test data. There may be some arguments for putting data from the test beds through this, the confidential test data. There may not. That is up for you to decide, but it shouldn't be the focus of the project. A little bit about business plans, just moving into a little bit more detail on that. All projects will be expected to demonstrate good value for money. So the proposals must include a schedule which shows the milestones for the costs for the investment that you're looking for from Innovate UK and from CCAV. So projects will also be judged on their business model and realistic plan for creating and committing to long-term operations of the facility. So the business models must include marketing and operation and maintenance for at least 10 years beyond the end of the initial investment period of the project. Completed facilities must operate commercially, with users paying a market rate, although by agreement, data providers may be allowed to provide data as payment in kind. This may well be true of local authorities who don't have money to spend, but they do have data. It must be open to several users on a transparent and non-discriminating basis, including small and medium enterprises. And the final part on business plans is that they must demonstrate how the facility is customer friendly for all, including international customers. The last sentence, I'm afraid, is a carryover from the previous competition, is not appropriate here, but whatever facilities which you believe should be, or which would assist in making those, making it easier for the customer to use, you should include. So apologies, that last sentence is actually inappropriate for this. Example customers. So examples of possible customers would include cities and transport authorities, organisations improving transportation by looking at congestion, logistics and transport companies, CAV manufacturers, data aggregators, companies which are looking to set up mobility as service services, SMEs looking at technologies behind CAV, cybersecurity companies wanting to develop new security products, and the rest I'm sure you can read. I'll not bore you too much. I do apologise that the presentation is all text and there's no pretty pictures like there were from the original presentations, so apologies for that. Data management and IT. Clearly, each facility must deploy protective security, whether be it cyber, physical, or personnel. I guess physical and personnel are probably less important on this particular project than cyber, but it will depend on the content of your project. Facilities must use consistent and secure data management and communication tools and processes, and the proposal should detail which data and technology standards you have chosen and why. And justification for that could include matching to national or international standards, or industry standards across the CAV industry, or indeed the communications industry. You must also show how you'll obtain any appropriate licenses or approvals for the communications that you need, if that is necessary. And the final point is, if 5G is part of the proposal, we're not saying that it has to be, but if it is, then you must work with the 5G testbed trials program managed by DCMS. And there is a link there, and the link is also in the scope document. Moving on to funding. Your project is expected to focus on investment aid for research infrastructures. So support will be given for the construction or upgrade of research infrastructures that perform economic activities. And these are considered as state aid, or the support is considered as state aid. In this context, the infrastructures do not need to be physical, they can be virtual as well as physical, or instead of physical. You may apply for funding support of up to 50% of your eligible project costs if you are a business, and you can apply for up to 100% of your eligible costs if you're a non-profit distributing research organisations, and if the activities in this project allow that under the Article 26 state aid rules. Whether they will do or not is something which we're not experts in, so we would strongly recommend that if you're looking to get more than 50%, seek legal advice on state aid rules about a particular application. If you do go above the 50%, demonstrate how the match funding for investment in the facility will be contributed after the project ends. In other words, within the operational phase. And this must be a minimum of the grant value requested, and might include such areas as maintenance costs and upgrades. So we expect the projects to have at least 30% industry contribution to the initial project costs, and it must be 50% of the industrial contribution to the lifetime of costs of the facility. And to try and clarify that, we've got a little diagram. So on the left-hand side, you can see we have the project build phase, and in this case, we're actually showing the maximum amount of funding that you could get on this competition. So let us say that, for example, that during the first phase, your total project costs are 7.15 million, then you can get up to the £5 million grant, which is obviously 70%. To make up the difference, obviously there is the 30% industrial contribution, which is in this case 2.15 million. That gets you to the black vertical line. However, you'd need to invest a further 2.85 million during the first 10 years of operation of the facility. And that would bring the industrial investment to a total of 5 million to match the grant value. So that's what we mean. If you happen to go to 50% from the start, so you're asking for 10 million within the build, sorry, you are expecting your total cost to be 10 million and the grant is 5 million, then obviously you'll achieve that at the end of the project, and that is absolutely fine. In fact, we prefer that. But we'd also appreciate that it may be that you want to use income from the operation, reinvest that to improve and update over the life of the project. So that can be part of that industrial contribution, and that's what we're showing here. Moving on to talk a little bit about Meridian. Rich Porter's obviously explained in quite some detail this morning about what Meridian is and what it's going to do. One thing we need to talk about in a little bit more detail, because there was confusion about this first phase, is how Meridian is funded. So the organisation is jointly funded by industry. Meridian 2 has to comply with state aid rules, you see. So it gets half its funding directly from BEIS, and the other half, which comes from industry, is effectively provided by the projects which Meridian is supporting, such as this. So consequently, 4% of the grant which you received for your project will have to go to Meridian. And that is mandatory for all the project partners. That money has to come from industry. It is not government money, so it is not a grant eligible cost. That's important. Also important is that if you are an organisation which is participating and you can't provide 4% industry funding, for example, if you're already a government-funded organisation, completely government-funded, then you'll have to find a way of getting that 4% to Meridian. And typically, that would have to be done by one of the other partners or split amongst the other partners. And in which case, we'd expect that agreement in the consortium agreement. That's the sort of information that we expect to be in the consortium agreement, how that will be paid. And clearly, Innovate UK and Meridian, we have a data sharing agreement which will support us telling Meridian basically how much grant is being paid so that they can invoice to the appropriate company. Looking at some of the other aspects of the competition scope, you have to work in collaboration with others. These are collaborative projects, which means we have a minimum of 2 partners, a maximum of 5. However, the maximum of 5 is a little bit elastic, and what we suggest is if you want to have more than 5 participants in it, then come talk to us. There's a practical reason why I put the limit on 5. Pretty much when you go beyond 5, every time you add a partner, you double what it takes to get your consortium agreement signed. So you can have 20 partners, but if you do, it'll probably take until the end of the world to actually get your consortium agreement signed. So from a practical point of view, we put the limit on 5. If you want to go above that, come and talk to us. I'm not going to say no or a definite yes. Come and talk to us about what you're proposing and why. No partner should have more than 70% of the costs. That's often used as a test as to whether a project is collaborative or not. So I think in this competition, it's highly likely that nobody will get anywhere near 70% of the costs for one partner. You have to carry out your project in the UK. We don't have the geographical constraints that went on the physical facilities, but in terms of doing the work, it has to be in the UK. So if you're a foreign company, you have to use a UK subsidiary. You can't use a branch office or a non-UK office. You have to demonstrate that the work will be done in the UK using UK staff. If you want to do things in the UK, that's great. Every little helps, all support, gratefully appreciated, but we're not paying for it. Okay. Subcontracting is allowed in this competition, and somebody can go out of the UK. But if you're subcontracting, you must justify why the subcontractor isn't part of the consortium. And generally, the assessors who will be assessing these competitions or these proposals will look for value for money for the taxpayer in terms of what is collaborative. So if it's not collaborative, it's being subcontracted, you have to say why that's the best route forward. And large subcontracts are often perceived, or not often perceived as being collaborative. So that will cause some concerns. If you need to do work outside the UK, you can do, but you have to justify why that is the case and why it can't be done in the UK. It's difficult to understand or difficult to imagine what that might be in this competition, but if that is the case, that is the rule. In terms of value for money, The value for money aspect of each application will also be reviewed by CCAV economists. So they will be looking for value for money or the cost benefit ratio as defined by the equation which you can see. And the process for doing this has been developed specifically for these CAV infrastructure competitions due to the nature of the projects. But again, I'd stress, please consult the guidance for applicants for any special requirements when looking at the value for money. In terms of variations from the scope for the competition has been developed based on the best information we have available. If you've got a project idea that you've developed that doesn't match what's stated here, and when I say doesn't quite match, it's being completely different. If it's nearly there, significantly different, please come and talk to us. Don't just sort of rule it out or put it in without talking to us first, because we want to find what is the best project for the UK. And we will need to work with you to do that. Okay, that's it from me. If you've got any questions, I'd ask you to contact the Innovate support staff, either using the telephone number or the email address provided. Thank you.
Q&A asking the questions there. In the meantime, Joe and Philip are going to do the application process.
Good afternoon, I'm from Innovate UK, and today me and my colleague Joe are going to be taking you through the application process. So some of this is going to reiterate what Richard has already said, but I think it's important to go over a few things twice, that way we know we're getting it right. So, using this thing. So I'm here, I'm Philip Haddo, Joe Lyford is with me. I will be taking you through the first presentation on the application process, and he'll be taking over the second half. Today, first, we will be going over the eligibility criteria for the competition. Following that, I will then take you through the application process and then the application form, including the questions that we're going to be asking you. So these are slightly different to our regular questions if you have applied before. So it'll be important to appreciate where the differences are for this particular competition. I'll then hand over to Joe, who will go through the funding rules for this competition. Again, these are quite different, so it will be good to get those to you. And he will then take you through the assessment and selection that will happen once the competition is closed. And then we'll have our Q&A panel for any questions that you might have on Richard's part or our part. So first off, I'm going to eligibility criteria for this competition. So for this competition, project costs can range up to a maximum of £10 million, and the project must commence by March 2019. The facility that you are funding must be operational within 12 months. And to lead a project, you must be a UK-based business or research organisation, carry out the work in the UK, and commit to exploiting the results of the work in the UK. Projects must be collaborative. And as I said, this application form has 10 questions with the opportunity for 4 appendices. I'll be going through these in greater detail later in this presentation, and this will also be detailed in the guidance for applicants. So the types of organisation that can apply, we can accept any size of business, small, medium, large, micro, or research organisations. That's universities and higher education institutions, non-profit distributing research and technology organisations, including the catapults, and public sector research establishments. Business and research organisations can lead, but public sector organisations and charities doing research activity can also take part in this competition. To be considered collaborative, at least 2 organisations must be requesting grant funding from Innovate UK. As Richard said, not one one partner cannot be requesting more than 70% of the cost. There must be evidence in your application of a genuine collaboration. You'll need to explain how all parties will contribute to the project in order to make it a success. Behind me on the slides now are the key dates for this competition. So the competition has now been open a week, and obviously the briefing event is today, but the important dates in bold, the first of which is the submission date. So that's Wednesday, the 5th of September, and it will close at noon. So that means if you're trying to submit your application at 12:01, we can no longer accept it. I stress to please try and get your application in ahead of time, because on submission day, our websites do receive high traffic with people trying to submit last minute applications. So I'd hate for a good application not to get through because of technical difficulties. If you're successful in the written stage, you'll be invited to interview on Friday the 21st of September, and the interview will be between the 15th and 18th of October. So please keep these in mind whilst making your application, since you'll need to be free these days to interview if you're successful in the written stage. We'll inform applicants on Friday the 9th of November. Through this entire process, please contact our customer support service in advance of the deadline if you experience any difficulties with submitting your application, so that we have plenty of time to help you and you can submit it. I will now go through the application process. So for this competition, you will be required to register. So this is on our website on the Innovation Funding Service. I believe there was a screenshot in Richard's slides. If you find the Meridian 2 competition, there'll be a green button which says register, and then we will email the application form to you. Then each partner will need to download a project finance form, and then these documents will have to be completed along with any appendices and uploaded to a secure FTP site. And this, again, is one of the reasons why we urge people not to leave their submissions to the last minute, in case you have any difficulties in uploading your documents. After this, applications that we deem to be in scope will be sent to assessors, and 5 assessors will take a look at them. I'll go into more detail on that on the next slide. And successful applicants will be invited to interview, and CCAV will carry out their value for money assessment on them. We will notify applicants by the 9th of November, as seen on the last slide, and everyone will receive feedback on your application, successful or not, within 4 weeks of receiving your notification. So, application assessment. All our applications are assessed by independent assessors drawn from industry and academia. What do they look for? From reading many lines of assessor feedback, I hear again and again what they want, and that is clarity, justification, detail, and that the applicant has presented a viable opportunity for growth. Our process, like I say, is we will do a scope check against our eligibility criteria before we send them to the assessors. And then if they're deemed to be eligible, 5 assessors will look at them. They'll send us back their scores and their feedback, and we'll collate these, and then the top ones will be going to interview. So to reiterate, the forms required will be the application form, where you'll answer the questions, a project finance form for each non-academic organisation taking part, and appendices if you're using them to go with your application form. If you have any academic partners, they will be submitting their forms through the JES system, which my colleague will be going through with you later. So now the application form, kind of the questions themselves, what we'll be asking you to fill in. On the slides behind me now is a breakdown of the application form. I'll be going through each question I'll be covering a few points of the guidance from each question, but I do urge you to look at the guidance for applicants, which will have the full descriptions for each question in order to help you complete them as best as possible. First off is the project summary. Now, this will be for internal Innovate UK, CCAV, and the assessor's use only. This will be a brief outline of your project, highlighting the need or challenge, the approach, the innovation, and your expected outcomes. This is useful because it sets the scene for the assessors, kind of lets them know more about the application that they're about to assess. This question is not marked, but is highly recommended. Public description of the project. This differs from the project summary because this description will be visible to the public. Since Innovate UK and CCAV use government money, there are rules regarding openness and transparency, so we need to publish all the successful candidates, and this brief description will be what the public will be able to see if they look at the results of this competition. As such, please be careful not to put any confidential information into it, and please note, funding will not be awarded to any application that does not include this section, since we are required to make it public. This part, again, is not marked. The first marked question is the scope question. And here you will need to show how your project fits within the scope as set out in the brief and guidance. It's important that you're in scope to receive funding. You might have a really innovative project with a comprehensive application. However, if it is not in the scope for this funding call, we are unable to fund it. As Richard has said, if you do need to get in contact with us to talk about an application, please do. And please give plenty of detail in this section to give the assessors the best chance they can to see that your application is in scope. The first question, marked out of 10, is the aim of this facility and what capabilities it will deliver? So some of the things that you need to cover in this question are detailing the aim and vision for the facility you intend to deliver, both in terms of the capabilities or services offered to customers. Describe how the facility's future operational model matches the organization's strategy and vision. And describe how the facility builds on any existing or proposed test facilities or centers of excellence and what benefits this offers. For example, enhancing existing capabilities, cost, or time saved in delivery by using existing infrastructure and operating models. The second question is, what is the size of the market opportunity? So there's no point doing the project if there's not the market there to use it. So as part of this question, we need you to describe the market and customers the facility and operating model will target. Describe where your proposal fits and what market share you believe you can secure, including the strategy that will deliver that share. Provide evidence where possible to support this, including letters of support, with clear financial commitments. The scope requires that business plans must demonstrate how the facility is customer friendly, as Richard stated, including for international customers. Just detail how you meet this requirement. Please especially consider international customers and competitor benchmarking in this section. The third question is, what will be the impact of this facility? So as part of this question, indicate the scale of operation, i.e. how many customers, staff and vehicles you expect to see using the facility in any day, week and year. So where possible, you can use evidence from existing customers and potential customers to back this up. Set out the return on investment that the project could reasonably achieve in low, expected, and high cases. We strongly encourage you to include a range of returns, risk-weighted, and not to use single number estimates. Describe any links to CAV collaborative research and development projects, and set out any wider social and economic impacts the project may contribute, being careful to highlight where this is direct or indirect. The fourth question is, how will the facility support the Meridian testbed, and how it will be developed beyond what is delivered inside of the defined project? As part of this question, we will need you to detail how the facility will cooperate with other test facilities as part of the Meridian UK testing community for CAV. This should include how the facility will support Meridian in promoting UK CAV capability, as well as how the facility can work seamlessly with other facilities to offer a joined-up benefit for customers. Describe how you ensure a strong link between the proposed facility and the other facilities within the Meridian testbed. Indicate how the facility will be further developed or improved beyond the timeframe or outside of the scope of this project. Detail any follow-on project or future improvement opportunities currently envisaged. The fifth question, what is the governance structure and operating model of the facility during operation? So as part of this, we need you to detail the project governance structure for the facility once it is operational. Detail how the governance team will be kept informed of progress and highlight concerns or issues early to all impacted stakeholders, including CCAV and Innovate UK. And detail the main commitments and responsibilities of each partner. This may take the form of a RACIC matrix, which is responsible, approving, supporting, informed, and consulted. How will the project be managed through the build phase? Identify who will lead the project day-to-day and how the project team will be structured. Outline the management reporting lines. Describe how the project will achieve effective project team integration between the partners, as well as the supply chain and any other main actors. So as part of this question, the assessors will consider, amongst many things, the technical approach and methodology, whether it's appropriate to the needs of the project, whether the project plan is sufficient in comparison to the complexity of the project. For example, is there enough detail to understand the tasks involved and the resources required? There is more that the assessors will consider, and this is all written out in the guidance for applicants. Question 7 is, what are the risks to project success, and what is the project's risk management strategy? So part of these projects and part of what Innovate UK do is we fund slightly risky projects. So we expect there to be some risk because otherwise it's not worth spending public money on. However, this question is more about making sure you've identified the main risks to your project and the uncertainties and have mitigation strategies in place. Rate the main risks as high, medium, and low. Identify project management tools and mechanisms that we use to minimize operational risk and promote a successful project outcome. Proposals should specifically address any legal agreements or consents that need to be put in place to enable the project to be undertaken. For example, are there software licenses you need, or are there copyrights that need to be managed? Question 8 is, do the project team have the right skills, experience, and access to capabilities, to deliver the project and identified benefits? So as part of this question, describe the track record of the project team members in undertaking and exploiting the results of data infrastructure or data testing facility projects. This should highlight your capability to deliver the proposal on time, to cost, and quality. For the consortium, is there evidence of additional benefit from the collaboration? i.e., we need the collaboration to be greater than the equal sum of its parts in order to show that bringing these companies together is creating additional benefit and there's reason for this collaboration. What is the financial commitment required for the project? So as part of this, we need you to detail the estimated project cost per work package, making clear the level of contribution from any project participants and the level of funding required from Innovate UK. This information should be provided in the finance summary taken of the application form, which I'll talk about in a few slides. Detail the spend profile by month, linked to milestones, gateways, and deliverables as needed. Clarify expected investment after the project to achieve 50% industry contribution if required. Assessors will be looking for evidence that the project is robustly costed and can be delivered for this stated cost. And it's important to note to make sure that all vital finance project points you want the assessors to consider are included in the main body of your application form, such as subcontract activities or financial commitments outside the project. You should expand on these in relevant detail in the appendix. These are the main documents used within the assessment process. The final scored question is, how does financial support from CCAV and Innovate UK add value? i.e., what would the consequences be if your project were not funded? So as part of this, explain what the contribution request from government is per work package and why it is good value for money. Detail how the funding required for the project is able to proceed. Funding required for the project to be able to proceed allows you to undertake the project both in terms of time to market and at scale, and explain why this would be beneficial to the UK. Demonstrate the return on investment for the partners involved in the project, as well as the UK taxpayer. This should be linked to the outcomes of the project. And finally, why would this project not be viable without government funding? The appendices you're allowed is up to 4, each of them covering different areas of the application. Appendix A would be providing additional support for questions 1 through 4. Appendix B would be providing additional information for questions 5 through 8. Appendix C is for you to provide additional information regarding each applicant organisation in your consortium. And Appendix D is to provide additional information to support question 9, and this should be used to detail the spend profile by month, linking it to milestones, gateways, and deliverables as needed. Important to note here are the page limits. So the first 2 appendices can be up to 5 sides of A4. Appendix C can be half a side of A4 for each partner. And Appendix D can be up to 1 side of A4. And I must stress that this must be legible at 100% zoom on the assessor's computers. So do use a good size font. You can't just make your font very, very small and fit in lots of words, because if they can't read it 100%, then they'll just have to not consider it in their applications. So please take that into consideration. Finally is the finance. This is a high-level finance document, and it shows assessors where the money is being spent between partners. As a part of this, you'll need to include the organisation name, the company registration number, the enterprise category, the postcode where the majority of the work will be undertaken, contribution to the project by each organisation, the amount of funding that you're seeking from Innovate UK, and importantly, other funding from public sector bodies, since this is related to state aid, so you do need to declare if there is more public money going into this project. And then at the final column, that's the total project costs. I am now going to my colleague Joe, who will take you through the rest of this presentation on the application process.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Lyford. I'm the portfolio manager for this competition from Innovate UK. So I will be managing the competition process up to the point that the successful project gets going. I'm going to talk to you about 3 things today, really. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about the funding rules for the competition, which are obviously different to our standard competitions. Secondly, I'll talk to you about how to submit your application to us. And finally, I will explain briefly what will happen should you be successful in applying to this competition. Richard and Philip have quite generously covered quite a lot of my content in their slides anyway, so that will allow me to keep this as brief as possible before we move on to the Q&A. As I've already mentioned previously, unlike our standard research and development competitions, the maximum grant amount that any business can claim for this competition is 50% of their total eligible project costs. For research organisations, universities can claim 100% grant funding, which is obviously 80% of the full economic cost. Other research organisations can receive 100% of their eligible costs, but they need to demonstrate how match funding investment will be contributed. In addition, they must be completely non-profit distributing, and they must clearly disseminate their project results. Likewise, public sector organisations or charities can also be included, and these can also claim 100% grant funding. But again, they must be performing research, and again, they must clearly disseminate their project results. So, as Richard mentioned earlier on, this competition is being run under the Investment Aid for Research Infrastructures, which allows grant funding to support the construction of or upgrade of research facilities. So this type of state aid is different from what we use for most of our competitions here at Innovate UK. The competition is limited to grant payments of up to 50% of the investment costs. At least 30% of the investment costs must be contributed by industry within the project itself. And then any outstanding industry investment costs must be made within the first 10 years of operation. And so there's at least a 50% industry matched contribution over the 10-year period. Finally, a couple of other points. The lead organisation must be requesting grants. The lead organisation has to be a grant recipient, and no single organisation should have more than 70% of the total project costs. So for all non-academic partners, you will need to submit a finance form to us as part of your application for this competition. And the total figures from these forms must be identical to the finance summary table within the application document, which Philip just mentioned to you a moment ago. That's very important. We can't have any discrepancies between what you have within your individual finance form and within your finance summary table as part of the main application document. We would not expect you to incur any operational costs in this competition, so these tabs should be left completely blank. So the finance form that you will be working on as part of this competition has both the capital costs and the standard costs that you may have seen in previous Innovate UK competitions. So you only need to complete the capital cost tabs, and you can leave everything else blank as you will not require them for this competition. You can therefore simply enter the detail behind any of the cost category tabs that you require to deliver your project. So on the screen now are the eligible project costs that you can include in this competition, and obviously these are just the capital costs. This includes acquiring or constructing fixed assets. It also includes capital enhancements, which should not be confused with standard operational costs. Capital enhancements should either significantly lengthen the life of the asset, significantly increase the value of the asset, or significantly increase the usefulness of that asset. So the very first section, the first cost category that we have in the finance form is capital equipment. In this tab, you should list all of the kit which you need to fit out the build project. The finance form document itself allows you to type in a description and a justification of any items that you require within this section. And then you can simply state the estimated cost of each item that you require. And then the total cost per that cost category will be calculated for you automatically. The next section in the finance form is property capital costs. So in this tab, you should list all of the costs associated with the build, such as the examples that you can see on the screen. And again, the format for actually inserting the detail and justifying any such items remains the same throughout all of the cost categories. The next cost category is capitalized labor. So in this tab, you should list all of the labor costs that you will incur as part of the build itself. And as a reminder, please do not include labor costs associated with the day-to-day running of the facility. So please don't include any labor costs that you would do as part of standard Innovate UK competitions. And the final cost section is other costs, which is to be used for items which simply do not fit into the previous cost categories. We ask that for each category you use, that you provide as much detail and support and justification as possible, as it will help our project finance team to conduct their finance checks on your application should you be successful in applying for this competition. From experience of working in that team, any vague or poorly explained items will always be queried further down the line. So in order to help us speed up the process of getting your project started, if you're the successful candidate, we do ask that you please provide sufficient detail up front to help us. And as any costs associated with the day-to-day operations are not eligible in this project, and you cannot claim any grant against them. We would, as I mentioned earlier, we would expect these tabs in the form to be left completely blank, so you don't need to worry about those whatsoever. These are the cost categories that we use for our standard competitions at Innovate UK, but are not relevant to Meridian 2. So the finances for academic partners and universities are handled slightly differently, and they're actually processed through the GES system. So this system is already familiar with academics and universities. It's owned by the research councils rather than us at Innovate UK, and it actually validates the costs for us to produce the 80% full economic cost figure, which we then use going forward. This slide, as you can see, provides an example and shows you which fields will need to be completed for all academic partners that are being included on an application, whose costs are obviously based on the 80% FEC calculation, with the remaining 20% not representing a contribution that can be included in the body of the application whatsoever. And as I mentioned, given that the GES system is not actually owned by us and it's owned by the research councils, any queries relating to academic costs, university costs, are best directed to the GES help desk, whose contact details are provided on the screen. Okay, so moving on, in terms of actually submitting your application to us. So Philip's already mentioned this, but I'll go over it again very briefly. In terms of the application process, firstly, you need to register for this competition through our website. So the competition can be found under funding opportunities, which is on our homepage of the Innovate UK website. There's an icon for it, I think, at the top of the page. Once you've registered, you will receive an email acknowledgement of your registration, followed by a second email up to 48 hours later. And it's in the second email that you will receive a unique username and password for access to our secure upload facility, along with your unique application number and all of the application documentation that you are required to complete. This will allow you to download the documents, work on them, complete them, and then upload them again to the FTP site before the deadline. And just to reiterate what Philip mentioned earlier, deadlines are completely absolute. It's always a noon deadline, and we simply cannot accept any applications that are submitted to us a minute after the deadline. So please do be very careful and make sure that you give yourselves plenty of time to submit to us. So in the public area of the site, there are some standard documents that you will find. So you'll have the finance forms, a sample collaboration agreement, and also a standard offer letter. And once you've actually received your name and password, you can sign into the secure website to access additional documentation for this competition. So everything that you have, everything you need will be available to you, and you can simply work on all of the documents and return them. So you can return the application form to us, obviously, with any appendices that you choose to use to supplement your responses to various questions. And you can also send the any GES documents that are required for any universities that you include as part of your proposal. And then obviously for non-academic partners, the finance forms with all of your capital costs. And when you've actually completed your application, you're happy that everything is looking good, please do check that your naming conventions and file formats adhere to the policy that we have in place. I need to stress that if you do have the wrong format, there is always a danger that your documents will not get loaded to the correct directory and therefore they won't get assessed. So please do be very careful with that. We need all of the appendices to be in PDF format so that the assessors can therefore view them easily when they come to work on marking your proposals. And as Philip mentioned earlier, the appendices do have set page limits. So please make sure that you always check them for any question that you wish to include an appendix for. This slide just highlights how to firstly log in to the secure FTP site, secondly, where to download the required documents, and thirdly, how to upload the documents once you have completed them and you're ready to submit to us. So as Philip mentioned earlier in today's presentation, we are running as part of the assessment process for this competition. So applicants who haven't highly enough at the written stage, so when we first get them assessed by 5 assessors, you will be notified accordingly that you're not successful, you're not going to be taken through any further, and you will have feedback on your application made available to you via the FTP site, which will obviously explain the reasoning as to why you have not necessarily scored particularly high. Applicants who, however, have scored highly enough at the written stage will also have the feedback to them, and they will be invited to attend an interview panel with us in Swindon, and you'll have your feedback made available to you to give you the opportunity to provide a written response to your feedback, which will then go to the panel ahead of the interview itself. So, familiar with the interview panel process at Innovate UK, it's a bit of a Dragon's Den style format that we have. You can bring up to 9 people from your consortium to present to a panel of 5 assessors for, I think, for this competition, it's up to 30 minutes before they then facilitate a question and answer session with you for up to 45 minutes and potentially invite you back into the room for a further 15 minutes of Q&A following an internal discussion. Your presentations, your attendee lists, and your responses to the feedback that you get will all have to be submitted to us in advance of you attending the interview so that we can give the assessors plenty of time to read it up front. But you will receive much more information on the interview panel process further along in the process for this competition. Be invited to attend. Finally, if you are the lucky candidate for this competition and you are the successful, you will initially be notified that you are successful, and you will then be issued a conditional offer letter, which all partners within your consortium will need to sign and return to us, along with the other documentation, which will receive more information of as part of the conditional offer letter. So we will conduct various things as part of the project setup process, including an internal finance check on all partners. And once everything has been returned, everything's been signed off, and we're happy that everything is in place, we will issue you with a second letter, which is the information letter, which you will need to sign and return. And at that point, once you've signed it and returned it and we're happy with it, you can crack on and get started on your project. The conditional offer is quite a lengthy document, but it basically just outlines the various terms and conditions of the award. It will always be sent to the lead partner. So whoever is leading from your project consortium will be the one that receives a conditional offer letter. But as I mentioned, all of the partners across the consortium must sign and return their own individual acceptance forms before you can actually return it to us. And the acceptance forms will always be at the very back of the conditional offer letter. Another very important milestone to be completed, which I think Richard mentioned earlier, before your project can actually start, is the return of the signed collaboration agreement. And obviously we require that for all collaborative projects. So this stipulates the relationship within the consortium. And from my experience, it's probably the most common cause in project starting. So please do get working on these as quickly as possible. They can be quite complex documents to work on, so we always recommend that you work on them as early as possible to avoid unnecessary delays further down the process when you want to crack on and actually get started on your project. As I mentioned earlier, finance checks are handled by our project finance team as part of our operations directorate at Innovate UK. These guys look after public money by ensuring that it goes to legitimate enterprises for legitimate purposes. So they will carry out a vital check on all consortium members to ensure that they can meet their financial obligations on the project, i.e. the match funding that will need to be in place. And secondly, they will carry out an eligibility check on all of the consortium members to check and ensure that all project costs are in line with both competition and state aid criteria. If they do have any questions on either of these areas, they will get in touch with you just to clarify any particular areas of interest to them. So please do be prepared to receive, well, they may well was asking for further information, so please do be prepared to answer any of these further down the line. And once you've actually started your project, it's important to know that grant is paid quarterly in arrears, and you can only claim costs which have genuinely and actually been both incurred and defrayed during the project period in question. You therefore need to be very careful with both your cash flow and your cost management. And finally, the project will be subject to quarterly monitoring by an appointed monitoring officer, details of which you would receive much further down the line if you are to be successful in this competition. Okay, thank you very much for listening to us today, and I think we're going to break now for the panel Q&A session. Thank you.
We're going to start the Q&A now. Neil and Rich, perfect. They can come there. Do we have anyone else to join? It's fine, right? No physical. Okay, so if anyone has any questions regarding the scope, process, Meridian helping you with this, please do ask. Anyone? Oh, I have one question. There is.
Thanks. I didn't want to try shouting. I just want to clarify the financing rules here, and possibly the easiest way for me to do that is just to give an illustration, and you can tell me whether I've understood it correctly or not. So imagine Conidigital, which is an SME, partners up with the university, and we normally have a 500k contribution to the project. The university has a 500k contribution to the project. I think the rules you defined state that the project overall can only get funded for 50%. Okay, the academic organisation is going to be funded nominally at 100%, which means the SME has to effectively find additional funding to bring up the level to 50% overall for the project. So with that example I've given, it feels to me like the SME would only be funded at around about 33% before the 4% is taken off to go back to Meridian. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes. Fundamentally, yes. And we appreciate that could be quite painful for the SME as you termed it in your example, and that's one of the reasons why we have this additional period of 10 years after the end of the project, but within the operational life, where you have some chance to actually make some surplus and to reinvest it, so it can come out of that surplus. So it's not such a heavy hit at the start of the project or during the actual project period itself.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, Sophie Peachy, Aortic Labs. First question around the capital costs. What if you need to procure a service? So, for example, we're talking about data, so what about cloud hosting? Is that an eligible cost?
So hi, I'm Neil Ryan. I work in the automotive team at Innovate UK with Richard. So it depends on whether the cost can be treated as a capital cost from your point of view. So if it's a capitalised service cost, then it's something good to look at as part of the eligible project costs. But the costing structure for this competition is very different to what would be eligible costs in our normal competition. So we do encourage everybody with specific questions and details around what's eligible costs to come through our competition support team, customer service team, that can help give advice on the detailed questions around eligible costs.
Okay.
But it comes down to whether it can be capitalised or not, essentially, and your accountants are happy for it to be capitalised.
Okay. I've got one other question, if I may.
Yeah.
What if we don't need the full 5 million? What if we can do it for less?
It's up to. It's always up to. So we're looking for value for money. It doesn't need to be the full £5 million grant. Or it's always up to. That's the maximum that we think is appropriate. But it's up to bidders to tell us what's the minimum they need to do what we're asking you to do. So lower cost projects are much appreciated from our point of view.
Thank you. Hello. It was mentioned there's a requirement for a dissemination plan in the proposals. Is the idea of that dissemination plan is it to be considered a sort of communications plan, public engagement, etc., or is it academic engagement in terms of ivory tower sort of connecting with academic journals or academic research dissemination?
Yeah, so I think when we use the word dissemination, we perhaps tend to think more about universities and what they're doing with the as a product of the money that we're giving them. But certainly in terms of the facility, and probably Rich can add to this, we're expecting a lot of activity to be around communicating to the world what it is doing, how it is doing it, and how it can support people active in this space to come along, use the facility, and ultimately get benefit from it.
Thank you. You have. Well, if anyone wants help with that, come to me. Any other questions? No? I will ask one. Because it's just one winner and because of issues that were raised by Conigital, what are the chances of actually having more than 5 partners in a project?
As I said in my presentation, you can have more than 5. We would recommend that you don't, but if you want to and you have good reason for that, then that's obviously something we'll consider. And if we consider that your particular case is acceptable, then we'll say so. So there will be clarity when we give you your answer.
Just to add to that, so there's a difference between being involved in the project and then actually using the facility when the facility is up and running. And there's a big distinction between those two things. And obviously we would encourage everybody in the room to think about engaging with the facility if it's of benefit to them once it's actually created. That's the whole point of it.
Thank you. Any other questions? No. And thank you. Yeah, I will.
Hi, Mark Smith-Sierra again. So in terms of the process of kind of building the consortium, one of the things which is mentioned is around the requirement to get the collaboration agreement sorted out. So that in terms of what we're going, the process of us going forward from here, effectively primarily start finding our collaboration partners, start building up the idea of a solution. Is the intention that we'd have then a collaboration agreement in place in advance of submission, or is it actually something where you submit and actually over the course of time prior to the actual kickoff of the Go Live project is when you're looking to do that?
Yeah, so I can answer that. So what we're looking for is a draft collaboration agreement at the point of interview. We essentially have asked for that because we want to have some reassurance that you will be ready to start as quickly as possible. So it hasn't got to be signed at interview, but sort of 90–95% there is ideal from our point of view. So we can be reassured that if you are successful, you'll be quicker to start than you perhaps would have been without that document in place.
I'd just like to add one point on that. It's very tempting just to say the standard collaboration agreement that's offered as part of the package and just effectively submit that. I'd suggest you don't do that think about it. Think about particularly IP and sharing of IP and what you're going to do in terms of what is IP that's generated, how is it going to be split, and at least getting in fundamental agreement between the partners before you start as to how that will be done. Just putting in effectively a blank or a simplistic consortium agreement at the start, you will get into trouble when you come to sign it before you sign your grant offer letter. So don't just treat it as being, oh, that's something we can get to later on. I think that's the point. Think about what is actually going to be in it and what you need to make your project work.
Thank you. I have another question there.
Simon Babes from Movement Strategies. I'm just interested to understand a bit more about the exclusion of operating costs from the applications. Is that a constraint that you're working with, or an approach to sort of encourage a desired outcome?
It's because of the state aid rules. Because the investment is for infrastructure, we can't have operating costs as part of the project. They can't be funded, I'm afraid. That has to be part of the business during the operational phase. So we're not allowed to fund that, I'm afraid.
Perfect. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay. No. Well, that's it. From the panel, they will be staying around. So if you have other questions, do find them. We can just jump into the pitch sessions. So for today, we have around 20 companies that have signed up.